The land out here doesn't try to tell you anything. It doesn't look different. It doesn't look staged. Heck, if you didn't know what happened, you'd probably just keep driving. But once you do know what happened, it changes how long you're willing to stand still. Tonight on the Midnight Drive, we're in southwestern Nebraska, at a place where something happened fast. And it didn't end clean. No legends, no embellishments, just an event. And whatever remains after something like that settles into the ground. And as we head back out onto the highway, there's one question that follows us. What exactly stays behind in a place like this? The road out here doesn't lead you anywhere dramatic. No sharp turns, no sudden elevation. It's just distance. Long stretches of land that feel the same, mile after mile after mile. Fields, wind, and sky that seems bigger than it should be. And eventually, you turn off onto a smaller road. It's less maintained. Gravel in some places. And the farther you go, the less it feels like you're heading towards something, and more like you're just leaving everything else behind. Massacre Canyon sits quietly in Hitchcock County, not far from Trenton, Nebraska. If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't find it by accident. There's absolutely no natural draw, no landmark that pulls you in. It's just land that opens and then dips. A shallow cut through the earth. It's very easy to overlook. It's very easy to misunderstand. Because it doesn't look like a place where anything decisive happened. And maybe that's why it feels the way that it does. There is a marker now. A monument placed decades after the fact. Something official. A way to acknowledge what took place without recreating it. You can stand next to it, read it, take in the information, and for a moment it feels like any other historical site. Contained, understood, but then you look up, out past the marker, across the land itself. And that feeling of just another historical site doesn't hold, because the monument doesn't define the space. It just points to it. The actual place is absolutely everything that's around you. The grass, the uneven ground, the way that the canyon pulls your eyes downward without asking you to follow it. And when you step away from the marker, that's when it starts to shift. The kind of change you notice after you've already felt it. The wind doesn't sound different, but you start listening to it differently. The space doesn't close in, but it does feel more contained. Like the land is holding on to something. Not physically, it's just the context of it all. And what a bizarre feeling to feel like the land is holding you in an enclosed space when everything around you is so wide open. Visitors who come here don't usually describe anything specific. There's no figures, there's no voices, there's no haunted history here. There's nothing that you can point to and say, that's what caused it. But they do pause. They spend more time standing still than they expected to. They look out across the same stretch of land and stay with it longer than they normally would. There's almost a hesitation. Like leaving too quickly would mean missing something. Even if they don't know what that something is. And maybe that's where the experience begins. Not in anything happening around you, but in how your attention changes once you understand where you are. Because this week, we've talked about places where the story comes first. A road where the legend shapes what you feel. A house where repetition builds a pattern over time. A cave where experience happens in the moment. But here, it's different. There's no interpretation required to understand that something happened. You don't have to decide whether you believe it or not. You don't have to question the source. It's already part of the historical record. And that changes the way you stand in a place like this. Because you're not waiting for something to happen. You're standing where it already did happen. That's a different kind of awareness. One that doesn't look for movement or sound, but it looks for understanding. And the longer you stay, the more that awareness starts to settle in. You begin to map the space differently. Not just the land, but as sequence. A place where people might have moved, where they might have stopped, where things might have changed direction. You find yourself imagining paths without meaning to. Not vividly, not like a scene playing out in front of you, just like impressions, fragments of possibility. And that's where something else starts to take shape. Not a story or a reconstruction, just a recognition that this ground has already held something very intense. Something fast. Something that didn't leave room for any explanation. And even though nothing is happening right now, that fact doesn't go away. It remains present. Not visually, not audibly, but structurally. Built into the way you experience the space. Some people describe it as a heaviness. Others don't use that word. They just say it feels different. Harder to categorize. Less neutral than it looks. And that's important because it shows up even without expectation. Even for people who arrive without knowing the full story. There's something about the layout of the land, the openness combined with the drop of the canyon. The way your perspective shifts depending on where you stand. That creates a kind of disorientation. Not enough to confuse you, just enough to keep you aware. And that awareness doesn't feel passive. It feels very active. Almost like the space is begging you to notice it. Not dramatically, just very persistently. And once you do notice it, it becomes harder to ignore. You start to understand why places like this don't need stories layered on top of them. Why they don't need embellishment. Because the reality of what happened here is already enough to shape how the place feels. Even now. Even in complete silence. Even with nothing visible to connect you to it directly. And maybe that's what makes this different from everything else we've talked about this week. Because here, the feeling doesn't come from what might be there. It comes from what already was. Wow, man. As you've probably already gathered, this is going to be a little bit heavier of a story than we typically do here on the Midnight Drive. I'd love to hear your thoughts so far. Please let us know in the comments below wherever you might be listening. And if you'd like, feel free to leave us a message on our hotline. We'll share it on the show here. It's 402-610-2800. 1036. So we need to clear something up straight away. The story didn't begin in the canyon. That's the part that's super easy to miss, because when you stand there now, it feels like everything must have happened right where you are. But the moment itself started somewhere else, earlier, before the land narrowed, before the movement turned into something else. On August 5th, 1873, a Pawnee hunting party was moving through this region. This wasn't unusual. Buffalo hunts were part of survival, organized, necessary, and in this case, sanctioned. There had been communication and understanding that this hunt would take place, that it would move through this area, that it would be allowed. The group itself was large, around 300 people. Not all of them were hunters. That matters, because this wasn't a war party. It was a community in motion, men, women, and children. People working, preparing, and traveling together. They had already been successful. Buffalo had been taken. Food was secured. The kind of outcome that should have marked the beginning of the return. Routine. But there were warnings. Reports that a Sioux war party had been seen nearby. It was a big war party. Moving with purpose. Some of them took those warnings seriously, but others didn't. Because warnings weren't rare. And not all of them turned into something real. That's how uncertainty works over time. It loses urgency. It becomes background noise. The morning they broke camp, there was no clear indication that anything had changed. Buffalo were spotted again. Hunters moved out ahead of the main group. The formation stretched, less compact, less aware. And that's when it happened. A force of over 1,000 Sioux warriors moved in, fast and coordinated. Not testing, not probing. This wasn't something that developed over time. It was immediate, it was overwhelming, and it was decisive. The first moments weren't structured. They couldn't be. There wasn't time. Confusion set in. Movement without direction. People trying to understand what in the world was happening in the moment, while it was already happening. Then came recognition. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't a possibility. This was real. And then, inevitably, panic. Some of the Pawnee tried to organize, to form a defensive line, to create some kind of a resistance. And they did for a short time. But the numbers didn't allow for it to hold. They were outnumbered. They were outpositioned. And more importantly, they weren't prepared for this kind of engagement. The order to retreat came quickly, not as strategy, but as necessity. Toward the canyon, toward the river, a place that looked like it might offer some kind of cover, some kind of boundary, but it didn't. Because once they moved into the canyon, they lost what little advantage they might have had. The Sioux moved along the ridges, higher ground, clear visibility, and what followed wasn't balanced. It wasn't two sides meeting in equal terms. It was pursuit. People running, trying to move faster than something that had already overtaken them. Women carrying children, others trying to help those who had fallen behind. The distance between them closed quickly. There are accounts of what was found afterward, not in general terms, not softened by time, very specific. It was very difficult. Bodies were scattered across the ground, not in one place. They were spread out, following the path of retreat. Many of them women, many of them children. Some found together, others separated. The kind of details that don't translate well into clean historical language because they weren't clean. There are descriptions of wounds that go beyond what would be necessary in a fight. From cuts to mutilation. Acts that carried something more than just the objective of stopping movement. And again, those details matter. Not because they make the story more intense, but because they reflect the reality of what the moment itself was. It wasn't contained. It wasn't control. It spread across the land, through the canyon, along the same ground you can stand on today. By the time it ended, dozens were dead. Some estimates place it over 60, others higher. And most of them were not there to fight. The sound carried. That's something that comes up in multiple accounts. Gunfire, screaming, echoing across the open land, heard from miles away. People who weren't part of it knew that something was wrong before they ever saw the aftermath. And when others arrived later, what they found didn't leave them, not as a story, but as something they had literally seen, something they had to process without any distance from it. That kind of event doesn't resolve itself cleanly. Even historically, even when it's written down, because writing something down doesn't remove the experience from it. It just preserves it in a different form. And this is where the tone of the place connects directly to what happened, because nothing about it built slowly. There was no escalation, no gradual rise, no moment where things could have shifted in a different direction. It arrived all at once, and it ended the same way, abrupt, final. When something happens like that, it doesn't give people time to process what's happening while it's happening, which means that processing gets pushed somewhere else, later, or into the place itself. The canyon doesn't show you any of this. It doesn't replay it. There are no markers in the land that point to where each part occurred, just the monument and the knowledge of what took place across the space around it. But once you know the sequence, once you understand how quickly it unfolded, it becomes harder to stand there without feeling it in some kind of way. Not as fear, not as something directed at you, but as context that doesn't fade. And this is where that earlier idea starts to come back into focus. The concept that places can retain events, not consciously, not intentionally, but as something embedded, recorded, not in a way we can measure, but in a way people consistently describe. We touched on this before. The idea that environments might hold on to moments of high intensity. That something about the combination of space, material, and experience leaves a trace. Check it out. It's one of our previous episodes we talk about stone tape theory. But again, in this case, there's no definitive proof of that even. No clear way to isolate it. But when people visit places like this, they often report something that fits that pattern. Not seeing anything, not hearing anything specific, just feeling like the space isn't neutral. Like something is layered into it. And Massacre Canyon fits that description closely because it wasn't just an event. It was an experience that unfolded across the land itself. There was movement. There was sound. There was fear. All of it interacting with the same physical space that you're standing in now. And even though none of it is happening anymore, the idea that it could have left something behind isn't as easy to dismiss when you're actually there. Because the land hasn't changed enough to separate you from it. It still feels open. It still feels exposed. It still feels like a place where something could happen quickly, without warning. And that similarity brings the past closer. Not visually, but experientially. And when you stand there long enough, that's what starts to settle in. Not what you see, not what you hear, but what you know, and how that knowledge changes the way you feel space around you. You're listening to The Midnight Drive. After something like this happens, there's a tendency to think that it's all over. That once the moment itself passes, the place resets itself. Time moves forward. The land returns to what it was. Grass grows back. Wind keeps moving. Seasons repeat. And on the surface, that is true. If you stood in Massacre Canyon today without knowing anything about it, you wouldn't see any evidence of what happened. No visible markers on the land itself. Nothing that interrupts the landscape in a way that demands explanation. It looks normal. It looks like wide open space. And that's what makes this particular story so difficult to understand. Because the absence of visible change doesn't mean the place feels empty. It just means whatever remains isn't physical. This is where the experience of a place starts to matter more than the appearance of it. Because once you know what happened there, you're not going to experience the space the same way. You don't walk through it as neutral ground. You carry the context with you. And that context changes how everything is interpreted. The wind isn't just wind anymore. It becomes part of the environment that once carried something else. Sounds, movements, voices that are no longer there now. But they were. And your mind fills that gap automatically. Not as imagination, but as reconstruction. It tries to understand what the space held. It tries to piece it all together. Where the people were. How they moved. Where things changed direction. And that process doesn't feel like storytelling anymore. It feels like recognition. Like your brain is trying to align the present with something it knows happened in the past. And sometimes that alignment creates something else entirely. A moment where the space feels slightly out of sync. Not necessarily wrong or weird, it's just layered. This is something that people have described in different ways for a very long time, and not just here. In places where events happened quickly, where there wasn't time for any kind of resolution, where the intensity of the moment didn't have anywhere to go. Some people explain it through memory, others through psychology. The idea that once you know something about a place, you can't separate that knowledge from the experience of being there anymore. And that is true. But it doesn't fully explain why the feeling can be so consistent across several different people's experiences. Even those who arrive without much expectation. That's where theories start to come in, not as answers, but as frameworks. Ways to describe something that doesn't fit neatly into explanation. One of those is the idea that we talked about earlier, that environments might retain events. Not in a conscious way, not as something active, but as something recorded. Again, the stone tape theory. It's a kind of imprint. The idea is simple. Moments of high intensity that involve fear, violence, and high emotions leave a trace in the physical space where they occurred. Not something you can see, not something that you can measure directly, but something that can be experienced under the right conditions. Again, there's no consensus around it, no clear scientific backing that proves it works that way. It certainly doesn't work every time if you were to get some sort of vibe out of the space again. It's not haunted in a traditional sense. But it all aligns with how people describe places like this. It's not occupied, it's just holding something. And when you apply that idea to Massacre Canyon, it starts to make a certain kind of sense, because the event didn't happen in one place. It moved across the land, through the canyon, over open ground. It wasn't contained to a structure. It was embedded in the environment itself. It matters because structures can change. They can be rebuilt. They can be removed. They can be replaced. But land holds continuity. It stays. And even when it changes over time, it doesn't erase what happened on it. It just grows over it, covers it, leaves it all underneath. And maybe that's what people are responding to when they describe that feeling. Not something present, but something underlying. A layer that doesn't surface clearly. But it does influence how the space is experienced. There are visitors who come here specifically because of that. Not looking for something to see, not expecting an encounter, they just are wanting to stand in the place to understand it. And many of them leave with a similar impression. It's not fear, it's not even unease in the way that people usually describe it. It's something quieter, it's something heavier. Like the space asks for attention without demanding it. Some visitors stay longer than they expect to. Others leave quickly. Not because anything happened, but because being there felt like enough. And that response isn't unique. It shows up in places where the history is difficult, where the history is painful, where the events don't resolve into something with a clean outcome. Because clean endings are easier to leave behind. They give you closure, a way to step back without carrying anything away with you. But events like this don't offer that at all. They don't provide a point where everything makes sense again. They just stop abruptly. And that lack of resolution feels like it stays with the place. Not actively, not in a way that reaches out, but in a way that lingers. And once you've felt that, even slightly, it becomes easier to recognize in other places. That same shift, that same sense that the space holds more than what you are seeing in the moment. And that's where this week starts to come together. Because each place we've been to has shown us a different version of that. A road shaped by story. A cave shaped by experience. A house shaped by repetition. A fort shaped by documented history. And now, a landscape shaped by something that happened fast, that didn't resolve. Different environments, different causes, but the same outcome. Places that don't feel entirely empty. And maybe that's the connection. Not what's there, but what remains. Not as something that you can point to, but as something that you notice. Something that you carry with you when you leave. Because once you've stood in a place like this, you don't just remember what you learned about it. You remember how it felt to be there. And that feeling doesn't always stay behind. What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below. You're listening to The Midnight Drive. All right, as we wrap up our time in Nebraska, I want to send an invite out to every single person who's watching or listening. We've gone through Iowa. We spent a week there. We've gone through Nebraska. We spent a week there. What state should we go to next? We'll spend a week there. Let us know in the comments or reach out to us on the hotline, 402-610-2836. You can text us there or you can leave us a voice message. If you'd like to use email, this is all one word, theretrowaveradio@gmail.com. And in the subject line, just write The Midnight Drive Stories. That's it. But yeah, where should we go next? And if you have a favorite story connected to that place, be sure to include that as well so that we don't miss it. There's a point in every trip where the road starts to feel different again. And it's not because the land has changed, it's because you have. You've spent time in places that don't resolve clean. Places where something happened, or something was experienced, or something was repeated enough times that it started to feel like more than coincidence. And at a certain point, those places stop feeling separate. They start to connect. Not geographically, but thematically. You begin to recognize the same pattern in completely different environments. Earlier this week, it was Hummel Park, a place that felt different after the sun went down. Not because of anything that you could prove, but because how it changed once the light was gone. Then it was John Brown Cave, a space where something seemed to respond, even if you couldn't explain how or why. After that, Seven Sisters Road, a story passed down long enough that it became part of the experience of being there. Then Captain Bailey's house, where repetition over time created something that didn't feel entirely empty. And then we had Fort Robinson, where the history alone was enough to change how the place felt, without anything else added to it. And now we have a stretch of land. Quiet, open, unassuming, and still not neutral. Massacre Canyon doesn't ask you to believe anything. It doesn't present itself as mysterious. It doesn't try to create an experience. It just exists. And that's what makes it different. Because the feeling doesn't come from expectation. It comes from awareness, from knowing what happened there, and realizing that nothing about the land itself has removed it. It's still the same space, still holding the same shape, still carrying the same context. And that context changes how you experience it. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that forces reaction, just enough to shift your attention, to make you stay a little longer than you planned, to make you look out across the same stretch of land and feel like you're not just seeing it as it is now, but as something layered with so much history. Something that has already held more than what you're seeing. And maybe that's the thread that runs through all of this. Not whether something is there, not whether something can be proven, but whether a place can hold on to what happened in it. In a way that changes how it's experienced later. Not by everyone, not every time, but enough. Enough that people notice it. Enough that they come back. Enough that they keep asking the same question. What exactly am I feeling right now? And maybe that question doesn't need an answer, because the moment you try to define it, you lose part of what makes it what it is. It becomes something fixed, something explained. And these places don't feel fixed, and they don't feel explained. They feel open, still in the process of being experienced by each person who passes through them. And that experience builds layer by layer, person by person, just like the events that came before. Different moments, different contexts, all existing in the same space. And maybe that's what it means when people say places remember. Not in a conscious way, not in a way that implies intention, but in a way that reflects accumulation. Everything that has happened there is still part of it, still influencing how it feels. Even now, even in complete silence. And maybe it's not just the place doing the holding. Maybe part of it is us, the way we carry information, the way we return to certain moments without realizing it, the way a single detail can shift how we experience an entire environment. Because once you've stood in a place like this, you don't just leave it behind you. You take part of it with you. Not physically, but perceptually. The next place you go, you notice a little more. You listen a little longer. You pause when something feels even slightly out of place. And over time, that awareness builds. Just like the stories do. Just like the experiences do. And eventually, it becomes harder to tell where the place ends and where your interpretation begins. And maybe that overlap is where all of this actually lives. Not entirely in the environment, not entirely in the mind, but somewhere in between. A shared space where memory, perception, and place all meet. And once you've been in that space, even briefly, it changes how the rest of the road feels. And as you step back into the car and close the door and pull away from the canyon, there's a moment where everything goes quiet again. The engine starts. The tires start to move. And the distance begins to rebuild itself behind you. The land flattens out. The road stretches forward. And slowly, the feeling starts to fade. Not completely. Just enough that it settles into the background. It becomes something that you carry without directly focusing on it. And Nebraska begins to fall behind you. Not abruptly. Not with a clear ending. Just gradually. Who knows? You might be back. Another stretch of highway. Another state line passed in the dark. But not empty. And not forgotten. Because now, you know what's there. And once you know that, it doesn't really